Well, good evening, and it is Thursday again, and we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. This is a series of talks on humility and leadership, calling it the Cruciform Way. And I'm assuming that if you're watching at this point, you've seen a few before, but if you just happen to be the first time that you check in with us, probably the easiest way is to go to our website, www.westsiderichdchurch.org, and then underneath videos, you will find this series, and then you could go through, and if you so choose, you could catch up onto where we are. And if it's not your first time, welcome back. There's two ways that you can be experiencing this. You can experience it live, and so we do this at 6:30 on Thursday evenings. Next Thursday, I'm going to start my vacation, and I'm just going to take 1 week off, and so I won't be here. And I'm trying to squeeze this in between, what I'm doing with Bible teaching and doing these lectures and all the other work, and then preaching. And I'll be beginning a new series in a couple of Sundays. And so next Thursday, no talk. And then, but if you do the Bible studies, we'll have Bible study next Monday and Wednesday. No talk on Thursday, no Bible study the following Monday and Wednesday, and then we'll be back at the talk on Thursday. And and I'll announce this at the end as well. Where we are is we have dealt with kind of introductory matters of just kind of talking about the issue of humility and leadership, and then and sharing with you, why I was doing this doctorate, what I was hoping to achieve. And then we turn towards building a biblical theology, and with great detailed examination, both of the biblical words for humility and leadership, as well as some key New Testament passages with examination about understanding some historical context, in particular, understanding the honor-shame culture of the ancient world. And we did all of that to really begin to try to understand not just how we might hear the word humility today, but really the content in the scriptures, in the New Testament in particular, about what it really meant when it was being taught through Jesus and through his apostles. And I'll read for you my long definition about kind of trying to capture the New Testament picture. The biblical concept of humility is the loving decision to disregard the benefits and privileges of our power and status for selfish ends, to deploy our resources and influence for the good of others, and scorning any shame or rejection from the world, to trust in God's promise to lift us up, to share in his glory. And now that's a long definition, but that gives kind of this complete summary of just all of the different strands of the New Testament teaching. More simply, something to kind of just walk around with, a truly humble person is one who seeks to use his or her power in service to others. And you'll see that strong association of being servant-minded. And this is coming from Philippians chapter 2, which is this place where the word for humility first occurs in all extant Greek literature that we have. And this call towards humility is founded upon the example of Jesus Christ, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God be something to use to his own advantage, but he humbled himself, taking on the nature of a servant. Now, from there, we've got that working definition of humility, and now we're leaning into and beginning to wrap our arms around a lot of the literature that is available to us about understanding this relationship of leadership and humility and how they go together, and having a broader conversation with research and experts and practical application. For the last few lectures, we've been focusing on the topic of leadership, and we began with this kind of question: do humility and leadership even go together? And one of the things to observe is not everybody sees it. There are a lot of books that won't even mention the word humility at all with leadership. But there is a growing consensus that humility and leadership do go together, and in fact that humility is significant for effective leadership. You'll get different degrees as far as the literature that you read, but starting with Jim Collins and his work Good to Great, who argues that humility is one of two of the chief characteristics that make the very best leaders. Humility is not only significant, it is altogether essential to be the very best leader that you can be. So not everybody sees it, but there is a growing consensus. But then the question is, what is leadership? Well, it's hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. Leaders are more made than born. Any personality type can become a leader, but your unique person is going to impact your approach to leadership. Now, we looked at and listened to some of the leadership literature. There's so much, just hundreds and hundreds of books on leadership. It'd be impossible just to really try to take all of that into the scope of this sort of a thing and examine that. But working towards that definition, there tends to be some common characteristics across the literature that when you focus on, what makes a leader, some things emerge. And in particular, in relationship to our discussion about leadership and humility, everybody agrees that character is an essential part of humility. And that's where then when we turn into it, not everybody will see that humility is a significant characteristic for a leader, but there's a growing consensus and appreciation. But what everybody agrees as they begin to turn into this is that we've got to define humility correctly. When we use that term and we talk about humility and leadership, we're not talking about somebody who suffers from so low self-esteem where they're walking around and doubting themselves all the time. That would be a common refrain that you would find as people talk about humility. There's almost an apology that occurs in the literature as they actually introduce the concept of humility. Apology less so among Christians writing in the field of leadership, more so among secular people, but we've got to define it. I also offered a rubrics as far as just a simple way that you can categorize literature and creating a grid into 4 quadrants with one axis where you look at, are you focusing on the organization or are you focusing on the individual? And then are you focusing on the task of leading, or are you focusing on the character and person who is leading? And you can have a book in any of the 4 quadrants and they can miss the significance of humility. But if you look at the nature of leadership books, the ones that tend to recognize the significance of humility are those that focus on the person leading, the individual instead of the organization, and the character over the task of leadership. And if you sit in that area long enough, it would seem, or for people who tend to be thinking about those things, humility begins to emerge. And now we're going to take a shift. And we've looked at a lot of leadership literature. And now we're going to look at literature on the issue of humility. Let me read a few things for you that I wrote. Leadership may be hard to define. The relative value of humility for leadership hinges upon the way leadership is defined. There's certain definitions where humility is never going to come up, and then others that begin to move us towards humility. But the heart of the problem when it comes to this issue of do humility and leadership go together isn't so much how we define leadership, but it's how we define humility. Humility has a long, storied history in Western civilization. It has gone from being despised. Back in the Greco-Roman period, it was originally despised before the writing of the New Testament. It was despised and seen as lowly and for those of lowly mind. And then it became highly esteemed, especially throughout Christendom, during that period of time where the church was at the center of culture and helped drive the cultural agenda. And it has come back in part of being despised again, at least in some major segments of our society. But of late, it is experiencing a small renewal of appreciation. And you will actually find that over the last few years, there's been quite a number of books that have been written on humility. Probably a little bit influenced on the leadership literature and the work of Jim Collins, but also probably of just looking at just the nature of our society as it moved more towards the individual, and that individualism that leads to an egoism and to pride, and then that's where, in the face of examples of pride across the spectrum in our society, humility begins to stand out as an attractive alternative. Humility is a broad-ranging concept that cuts across many fields. And so we're going to spend some time in humility. We're going to start with history. And I'm going to share with you a couple of books that actually look at the history of the virtue of humility. And if you're trying to familiarize with the topic, studying its history, and now there's not very much written in this area. One of the things about humility that's also surprising is you won't find too many full-length treatments on humility outside of Christian spiritual writing. You'll find some books on humility, and every once in a while, when you turn to philosophy, and especially moral philosophy, you'll find a couple of books or at least significant journal articles that deal with humility. But until quite recently, not too many things written exclusively on humility. After we look at humility, we're going to turn to the Christian tradition. This was one of the arguments that is part of my thesis, is that I believe that the teachings of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the Christian tradition will provide the resources that we need to pursue and cultivate humility. And now, when I say Christian tradition, we have 2,000 years of Christian tradition. And so, obviously, you're never going to cover it all. But, in particular, when you look at the Christian tradition, monasticism stands out as a place to turn, because for more than 1,000 years, the central pursuit of most of monasticism was cultivating humility, because they saw it as the central mother essence of virtue that leads to the knowledge of God and the love of God. And so as we look at that, then it's like, well, that's a huge topic. And so we're going to discuss Augustine or Augustine, and the interesting thing is both pronunciations are correct. Kind of depends on where you're coming from, Europe and UK, America. I tend to say Augustine. So we're going to look at Augustine, and if you've never really heard about Augustine before, don't worry, I'll explain it to you. We're going to talk about Benedict and of Curcia, who wrote a book called The Rule of Saint Benedict, which is probably the most significant book that has shaped monasticism, Christian monasticism. And then we're gonna look at one more significant figure, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a monk. And the interesting thing about Bernard was he wrote a book on humility. He was an abbot who focused his life on leading a monastery, but he stepped out of the monastery and he became a world changer, and he had incredible influence for a period of time over all of Europe. And so there was this part where part of him was reaching for the spiritual life, and the other part of him was actually exercising leadership at a high level out in the world, and he was wrestling with how to hold on to humility. And so it becomes a great example of looking back in history and hearing somebody who was wrestling then with the tensions of leading and pursuing humility, and how do you do it with a lot of practical wisdom. And I was quite surprised as I read both primary works. Primary works are, I actually read through many of his writings on humility, and then some of the secondary literature that's becomes specialist, characterizing, analyzing, and explaining Bernard's approach towards monasticism, and in particular those things that we're focusing in on his examination of humility. Now, those will be kind of what we look at in our long past. I'm going to introduce some books that have been written by Christians in the last 100 years, and these tend to be a little bit more devotional. And I'll tell you about some of the books that have been written that I read on humility, and give you a little bit of an idea of whether you'd want to pursue them. I'll make the argument that almost all of those books kind of have a weak definition of humility, but they still have some good practical insight. And then I'll just briefly cover a couple of other areas. We'll cover philosophy, moral and epistemology, but I'm just going to give you just a little brief thing. Probably won't be any of interest, but we'll see. Part of this is me testing this material out, looking for input from you all, and then the final thing we'll do is we'll come back and we'll look at leadership literature again, in particular how they address the issue of humility, and so with that, turning to first the historical perspective, I would say there's not too many things that are going to give you a historical survey. There's, in fact, there's really only one full-length book that is that is a beginning point where you could get this tour of the virtue of humility, and it's one that I've recommended already. John Dixon's Humilitas. And this will be one of the books that I'll list as far as a suggested bibliography. It's one of my favorite books that I've read. The book represents the fruit of Dixon's participation with a team of Macquarie University's Department of Ancient History, exploring humility as a social virtue. And so, he's a historian, he's a professor, he's a researcher. He was part of a team of people that took it on the task of really exploring the history of the social virtue of humility and to give a report on it. And this book is the fruit of that. But the book ends up being more than that. One of the interesting things about Dixon's work is that while it was generated out of historical research, what he ends up writing is more of an argument for people to pursue the virtue in contemporary life. I'll actually quote Dixon for you, and this is his advice at the beginning of his book. Please don't imagine that humilitas is some earth-real call to plumb the depths of history and philosophy. Despite the pretentious Latin root title, this is essentially a practical book. Apart from a section on the origins of the virtue of humility in the Western ethical tradition, which readers should feel free to skip over, most of what follows is a straightforward attempt to describe the importance of humility for contemporary life, for contemporary love, and for leadership, and to outline the very real benefits of humility. And so what happened is that Dixon got involved with this research project, and he began to study the roots of humility, and he began to see what the Bible was really saying about tapophrosune, this lowering oneself, disregarding your shame, using your resources for the sake of others. And he fell in love with the virtue. He became, this is so important. I didn't know. And then he started thinking about this and how do we win over our society back to reclaiming this virtue? And this book is his attempt to try to say, this is really important, people. This can change the way that you live your life. So you're probably not surprised why I like the book so much. But the first thing Dixon asserts is that humility does not mean humiliation, even though both words, humiliation and humility, come from the single Latin parent humilitas. He feels the need to defend humility from the common negative cultural bias. Humility is not being a doormat for others. It is not a problem of low self-esteem or intentionally holding back ambition to achieve. According to Dixon, the peculiar Western meaning of humility derives from the usage of Hebrew-speaking Jews, Latin-speaking Romans, and the Greeks, in particular Greek-speaking Christians of the first century. And Dixon basically makes the argument that the idea of humility, as he defines it, finds its roots in Jesus and his followers. And the way that this understanding of humility has impacted the world, and the way that we should understand the call to true humility, altogether begins with Jesus and his followers. Now, he looks at the three word groups in Hebrew, anawa, in Greek, tapeinos, and Latin, humilitas. They all derive from the idea of being low. Used negatively, all three terms could be used in the sense of to put low, or they can be used sometimes to mean humiliate. These words can be used positively, at least in the Christian sense of what we've come to understand, to lower yourself, or more commonly where we say to be humble. And if the root of the idea of humble is to make low, then to be one who makes yourself low, that's a picture of humility, of being humble. In Dixon's appraisal, the two uses are radically different. He really does want to separate. Humiliation is one thing, humility is something else. And so he says this: humiliation is the awful experience of being conquered or shamed. This was the dominant usage in the ancient times. Now, the revolution, where this idea became something more than that, he says is from Jesus and his followers. And probably the most important quote on this: interesting, what established humility as a virtue in Western culture was not Jesus' persona exactly, or even his teaching, but rather his execution, or more correctly, his followers' attempt to come to grips with his execution. The greatest man that they had ever known was brought down to the lowest place the Roman world could envisage, death by crucifixion. Either Jesus was not as great as they had first thought, or the notion of greatness had to be redefined to fit with the fact of his seemingly shameful end. It is without question that Jesus and his followers expressed the positive view of humility, and this became the dominant usage in the late Roman period all the way up to the modern period. Now, Dixon offers a definition of humility. It's the one that has most influenced mine as far as thinking through how to structure mine. You'll see some resonance between what he says. Humility is the noble choice to forgo your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. More simply, you could say that a humble person is marked by a willingness to hold power and service to others. Dixon went on to clarify that there are three key components needed to inform his definition. And I think it's important to hear this because we're trying to get this idea into us. And one of the things that he says is that humility, biblical humility, presupposes dignity, inherent dignity. The one, being humble, acts from a height. They are willingly and intentionally stepping down. True humility assumes the dignity or strength of the one possessing the virtue, which is why it should not be confused with having low self-esteem or being a doormat. Cloud, Robinson, and Thrall, three writers on leadership. Henry Cloud wrote the book Integrity. Bill Robinson wrote Incarnate Leadership. Thrall, with a number of others, wrote a book called The Ascent of a Leader. And they would all affirm this same idea, that the real idea of humility is not about being a doormat. And they use the very same language. The second thing that Dixon notes about humility is that humility is a willing choice. If there is no choice, if it's just about you being pushed low, then it's humiliation. But when you make the choice to forgo your status and your benefits and you willingly step down into that lower position, now that's humility. Finally, humility is social. It is more about how we treat others than how we think about ourselves. And I think that is also a very significant thing to always keep in your mind. Just like love, it's a relational virtue. It's a social virtue. I can't really love the way that I'm created to love and called to love, and you can't really love all by myself. I could love myself, but I wouldn't even know what loving myself really is until I start to be in a relationship. I can't be humble all by myself, because humility is about the position that I take in relationship with others. Now, another work of historical analysis that requires mentioning is Stephen Perdue's The Mind of Christ, Humility and the Intellect in Early Christian Theology. Now, unlike Dixon, which was this general call to humility, and it was based out of his research of really examining the moral virtue across history. This is a more specialized treatment. It would not be the first book that I'd recommend to somebody. If you are interested about the history of theology, and in particular you have some interest in moral philosophy and epistemological virtue, this might be a place for you. And you're probably, who does that? Somebody out there you might. This would be a good thing for you to look at. The value of it is that he does a good job providing some information about the way that the early church understood humility. In particular, he has discussions on Clement of Rome, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and he culminates in Augustine. And so here is a source where you go, okay, I could read a chapter or two and I would get a picture of how some of the significant early church fathers really discussed the virtue of humility and understood it, on the other side of the New Testament and the way that it shaped them. One of the weaknesses of this work is that for whatever reason, he doesn't bring in any of the social aspect of an understanding of humility. It's mostly just this individual thing about how you think about yourself. Humility is a long-term tendency to recognize and embrace creaturely limits in such a way that by working of divine grace, those limits are surpassed and expanded over time. And you have this sense of, I'm not God, I'm only human, and therefore I need to take my proper place. And that's kind of his working understanding of humility. Now, one of the interesting things was, he read Dixon's early work and the study from Macquarie, and there's nothing in here at all about really appreciating the historical context of the honor-shame culture as well. And this is the part where, in some ways, he's using the concept of humility towards his larger ends of examining how humility could help you pursue intellectual virtues. And so you'll get some information, but it just isn't as helpful. And I think that's all I'll say about that book, and I'll move on, because I want to get into the part where we move into the Christian tradition and we begin to have a discussion about Augustine and about Benedict and about Bernard of Clairvaux. A few things. Humility is a uniquely Christian virtue. Before Jesus, it was despised. It became a virtue because of the influence of Jesus and his followers. It was esteemed for more than 1,000 years in the Christian tradition, and this is in the words of John Cassian, an early Christian father and part of the desert monk movement. Humility was the mother and mistress of all virtues. And I'm giving you there a perspective of the way that the monks pursued it. At the center of the monastic movement, and to give a little perspective, so the monastic movement, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and was accepted under Constantine, and it no longer was being persecuted, we Christians struggle with comfort, success. The church became successful. And in this new period, it was easy to have the name Christian, and there wasn't consequences. It was something that people desired so that they could have status in the Roman Empire. And this is the beginning of more of the idea where you can be a nominal Christian, where you carry the name Christian, but the life of Jesus is dimly lit in you, if at all. But if you're in love with Jesus, if you know Jesus, if your life has been changed by Jesus, well, you know that's not the way to live. And so one of the things that happened is that as the church began to become this, there was this movement of people who said, okay, and we won't be surprised by this. We can see some of this today. What's happening in the cities? It's too secular. It's too ungodly, and so they went out and they pursued God on their own. And we call these the desert fathers. And there was some community out in the desert, but they were mostly individual. And this is the beginning of a real concerted effort of pursuing the spiritual life with God, and that takes on a new form. In the beginning, it was individualistic, and we would call it, I'll give you a big fancy word, hermetic monasticism, from the idea of a hermit. It's the isolated one. But there were those who saw this, and they saw, these people who committed their life to prayer, to listening to God, whatever scriptures that they might have, of knowing God's word, pursuing conformity to Christ. But some of it was, it wasn't social in nature. It's them by themselves. And when you go and you're by yourself, you'll run into limits about what it means to really be the church. They became examples in some ways to people that they look up to for their devotion, their commitment. Athanasius, Augustine both wrote lives. Athanasius, The Life of Anthony, is a famous one, where they told the stories of some of these people. And they became examples of kind of going, wow, here's somebody who really was committed to Christ. They forsook the city, they went out into the wilderness. But there was some that, saw some of the wisdom, but they said, something's missing. And there was this movement towards what became known as cenobitic, which is communal, where now you have monasteries. And for about 1,000 years, the people who were considered to be the most spiritual, the most serious, the ones who were probably most devoted to pursuing Jesus were seen as these monks. They made obvious sacrifice. They took vows of poverty and chastity and work and simplicity. And people could see that and say, wow, they're taking spiritual matters seriously. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be all that spiritual. When you get into the life of the monk, there's ways that you miss the relationship with God. But by and large, here's a group of people who took discipleship seriously. And this group of people, what they came to, what they basically almost all of them agreed upon, and there were different schools of thought. They would emerge. One of the first and most significant and did the most is this Benedict of Cursia, who became known as Saint Benedict and created Benedict's rule. And Benedictine monks have existed since that time. They argued that humility was the mother of all virtues, that their pursuit of becoming a monk was really a pursuit of humility, not to be known as humble, because it was about what they believed humility would accomplish. And what they believed humility would accomplish would be the ability to come and to know and to love Jesus Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit, not just in the idea, but to experience His presence and His power. And in that, you go, yep, they got it right. To walk the path of humility is an accurate description of the entire monastic life, desiring through humility to know and love God. Now, I'm not going to plumb all the depths. We're going to focus on Augustine. We're going to focus on Benedict, and we're going to focus on Bernard of Clairvaux. The reason for focusing on Augustine is the impact that Augustine has had on Western civilization and the way that he reformed the pursuit of virtue and shaped moral theology in Western civilization. Saint Benedict we're going to look at because of the impact that he had of shaping the entire movement of communal monasticism, cenobitic monasticism. And then Bernard, because he became he wrote one of the most influential spiritual treatises on humility. And because of that unique place that he had of pursuing humility in the role of being a leader, and not just the leader of a monastery, but a leader on the world stage. And a book that I would recommend if you have any interest about really trying to come and understand the monastic movement and their understanding of humility is this one. And I know that that you're going to see this backwards, so I'll show you the book and then I'll read you the title. Reclaiming Humility: 4 Studies in Monastic Tradition. It's technical, so this book isn't for everybody. But if you are interested in really trying to get a better understanding about Augustine, about Benedict, about Bernard, this would be a good place to go. Especially, this book is about humility and the way that it was being worked out in the monastic tradition. Now, one of the things that Flauscher reminds us of is that monasticism has had a significant impact upon shaping the Christian understanding of humility. But its impact is coming out of the reality of the place that humility had in the contest between the Greco-Roman world and Christianity. In the meeting of the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian worlds, the word humilitas signals a very real contest regarding the end of human life and the conduct of social relations. Is the goal of human life the accumulation of honor, or is it about the enjoyment of God? Are social relations primarily determined by honor and status, or are social relations determined by love? And so she's reminding us again that the center of the contest between paganism and Christianity is this issue of humility. And monasticism understood it in the very practical level, that if I pursue a life of humility by being shaped towards this rule that is going to allow me to practice and form humility, which will allow all of these other Christian virtues to be formed in me, then I'm going to overcome the influence of this world and begin to relish, to taste, and experience the kingdom above versus the city below. Humility stood at the crossroads between the choice of paganism and Christianity, and monks willingly stepped towards humility by stepping towards monasticism. Now, for Christians, humility became a virtue. But there's something, a little bit of history you need to understand about the whole history of virtue. Alistair MacIntyre, who is a significant moral philosopher after virtue, a study in moral theory is his seminal work. He says, in the 5th century BC, a crucial development occurred where the notion of virtue extended beyond fulfillment of a social role to a consideration of how to have and experience the good life. And this is where we begin to see the movement of, if you're familiar with any Greco-Roman philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are the biggest names. And we have nothing of Socrates' writings, but we have his life. Plato is one of the ones that we get a description of his life. Plato was Socrates' student. What we really get is we get Plato's teachings about Socrates, which ends up being Plato's teachings. And Aristotle was Plato's student. And in this movement with Plato and Aristotle, you begin to have this discussion about eratos, virtue, and it being tied to the good life. And now it's not just where do you fit within society and what role do you have to play to uphold the city-state, but how do you fulfill the good, the true, and the beautiful inside of you? And this began the pursuit of virtue. And one of the things that's often missed as far as our understanding of the ancient world is that we are so accustomed to the idea that following Jesus is about the formation of a Christian character that is virtuous, that is moral, that chooses the good over the evil, that we we use this term religion, we automatically think that religion is about morality. But if you wanted morality in the ancient world, unless you were a Jew or a Christian, you didn't turn to God and religion. The gods were fickle. There were many gods, and some of them were capricious, and some of them tended towards dark things, and some of them tended towards good things, and you never knew what up and down was, and they all acted differently, so typically safety in numbers. If you wanted virtue, if you wanted the good life, if you wanted discussions about morality and right and wrong, you turned to philosophy. A little warning, when Paul was speaking in Athens and he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus, they probably more assumed that he was a philosopher than a priest. He wasn't so much promoting religion, but he was promoting a philosophical school about how to live your life. Paul wouldn't have seen it all that way, but he would have understood that's how they saw it. That shift where you're beginning to have this discussion and pursuit of virtue and the virtuous life, and understanding that if I pursue that which is virtuous, I will have a better life. There was this common understanding, the good, the true, and the beautiful. It all goes together. Now, as Christian message spread into the Greco-Roman world, Christian apologists, those who began to explain the gospel of the Greco-Roman world, trying to win them over to Christ, began to utilize the language of virtue and the good life. But at the very same time, they didn't just wholesale adopt Platonism or Aristotelianism into their system. They baptized it into Christ, but we've got to use some language for it. So we're going to use, for example, that you'll find this in the New Testament, the language of eusebia. We translate that godliness. But for them, it was a specific type of godliness, the godliness of the good life. It was the life that the gods enjoyed, and the way that we humans can begin to taste that life was argued was through virtue. That is this moving through of, we've got this content, you have these words, and there's a bridge place where we can talk about this. We're going to redefine some things for you. Christians did that. And what they argued is there's some truth here, but the true story of the whole world is in Jesus Christ. And while you're touching and you're tasting some of the good life, the reality is found over here. Origen of Alexandria, who lived and wrote between 186 and 255 AD, made a formative contribution to the synthesis of classical and biblical thought. He identified Christ not simply as the exemplar of virtue, but also its embodiment, its source, and the goal of the virtuous life. And that's a little bit of a backdrop into Augustine, because we're talking about Augustine because of the impact that he's had on Western civilization. And in particular, the way, and Augustine, we're going to date him in the 400s into the early 500s. He for 1,500 years now, he's had an influence. In fact, probably the biggest influence on Western civilization outside of Jesus and the apostles is Augustine. Now, we don't talk about him much, we don't think about him much, but he's in the backdrop. And now, there's going to be a couple things today that you're going to hear about that go back to Augustine, and like one of them is the 7 deadly sins, and he didn't come up with that idea, but he had a big influence on why there's 7 deadly sins, and you'll hear that in just a moment. Augustine, who would have the largest impact on Christian theology and Western thought outside of Jesus and the contributors to the New Testament, he critiqued and he reordered the hierarchy of the classical virtues. Augustine is representative of the early Christian critique of Greco-Roman virtues. One of the things that he argued is that pagan virtues were fundamentally self-seeking. They were founded in human glory. They were selfish, and they were about my glory, my honor. But Augustine said the goal of life is knowledge and enjoyment of God. And therefore, the goal of virtue is not your glory, but it's you coming to God. Now, as Christians, we hear that and we go, yeah, that's sounding right. Now, Augustine did not reject all Greco-Roman virtues. Instead, he presented 3 superior theological virtues. And this is this part where he's speaking into a world that has now accepted Christianity but still has a large pagan history and influence. And he's arguing this is the way of the best life. And so the most important virtues are virtues that have been revealed through the revelation that God has given us in Jesus Christ and the Scriptures. And so we as Christians, we're going to be familiar with this as we become students of the Scriptures. The 3 chief, most important virtues for Christians and people to pursue, to live the good life, are faith, hope, and love. And those were not Greco-Roman virtues. Those were revealed virtues, and those become the first 3. But 7, nice number of perfection, most important. There are 4 other virtues that the ancient world pursued. They thought were significant. Prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. And those became the primary 7 virtues that you should pursue. And those 7 virtues were contrasted with 7 deadly sins. And one virtue contrasted with one of the 7 deadly sins, so that if you pursue this virtue, it helps overcome this sin pattern in your life. That resulting scheme of 7 virtues has influenced moral theology to the present. And that's part of the foundation of going back to Augustine. Now, humility is not part of Augustine's schema of seven principal virtues, but this does not disprove Foucher's comment that humility stands at the center of the contest between Christianity and the Greco-Roman world. For Augustine, humility is the very quality that distinguishes Christianity from paganism. Augustine, along with many other church fathers, Basil, John Chrysostom, who were near contemporaries, named humility as a theological virtue in their writings. Now, this is my summation, this is my surmising. Perhaps the reason humility was not part of Augustine's seven principal virtues is the role that humility was understood to play. Humility is what I would call a coordinating virtue. And what I mean by this is that humility was never seen as the goal, that their goal was never to be known as humble, but it was a powerful and guiding virtue that enables us to achieve the other virtues and arrive at the goal, which is Christ. Many writers after Augustine described humility in this very way, where humility is described as the chief, mother, and source of all the virtues that allows one to know God, enjoy Him, and to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus Christ. Augustine shaped moral theology. There were seven principal virtues, but now the goal of the virtuous life is not your glory, but it's to know God and to enjoy Him. It's balance between the revelation that God gives of Himself, which informs the virtuous life, faith, hope, and love. It affirms truth that we find out in the world and other people commonly understand as virtues. And humility was a theological virtue for Augustine, and it was in particular a virtue that helped assist all these other virtues come out. There's one more important piece that Augustine adds that ends up shaping the discussion of humility throughout the rest of the Christian tradition. And that is that Augustine understands that humility is not so much a quality to achieve, but comes through the grace of Jesus Christ. In his second exposition of Psalm 31, Augustine makes this point clear. The way of humility comes from no other source. It comes only from Christ. It is the way originated by Him who, though most high, came in humility. What else did He teach us by humbling Himself and becoming obedient even to death, even death on a cross? Now, this belief creates a tension between the notion of humility as a virtue and humility as a grace. And this may play into why he didn't call humility a virtue but a grace, but he would have also said faith, hope, and love were graces as well. So that it doesn't explain everything. But you see, a virtue is something that you cultivate. It's something you pursue. And so how do you pursue humility if the only way that you can receive it is a grace? But we will run into that tension with love, even with faith and hope. So, but that comes something that is a tension that as we continue through the Christian tradition, we will continue to grapple with. Now, in the end, I would say it is a grace and it's a virtue that we look to cultivate in the Spirit of Christ, through the Holy Spirit, through His help. He wants to form it in us. The relationship between humility, divine grace, and human freedom subsequently becomes a persistent and necessary theme in the monastic tradition and a source of continual tension. What is the true essence of humility? How can we pursue humility? If it's fundamentally of Christ, how then is human effort involved? All through the monastic tradition, people continue to grapple with those questions because they accept humility as a grace. But they also go, but it's something we're pursuing, and it's a virtue, and it's going to help all the other virtues. I think, let's see here. That's getting a little bit too technical, so let me move forward. And I'll just give a brief introduction to Benedict of Nursia. According to the rule of St. Benedict, humility is a ladder. Fulcher asserts that the ladder of humility is among the most abiding and influential constructs that accompany the spread of the rule of St. Benedict. So realize that this became the most influential monastic work in history. It's still in print today. People still read it for spiritual insight. It still influences many monastic orders. But the part of the reason that it spread in the beginning was because of its discussion of humility and the way that it used this metaphor of humility as a ladder that helped everybody kind of go, oh, this is how we cultivate it. And so that because they saw humility as such a central part of how we get close to God, this all goes together. The success of the book is about the success of how he's able to capture an explanation of the pursuit of humility. The discussion of this ladder is found in the 7th chapter of the Rule Book of St. Benedict. It is the longest chapter, and for somebody like Paul de Lot, who is a contemporary monk writing on monasticism, he says, this 7th chapter, with its discussion of humility, is justly regarded as the finished expression of monastic spirituality. And what he's saying here is if you want to understand monastic spirituality, just go read chapter 7 of the Rule Book and its discussion of humility, and that's what it's all about. And that is where we go in the monastic tradition, central to it. If you're going to understand it, it's about humility. But you got to really get to what were they looking for? How did they understand it? More recent scholarship, including Fulcher, maintains that this chapter exhibits a surprising lack of clarity concerning the notion of humility itself. It's significant, it's important, but more modern treatments have said there's a little bit of ambiguity of really understanding how this concept of humility matches up with the biblical concept of humility. And there's hundreds of years, I think there's about 450 years separating the New Testament writings with this. And so this is one of the things where right here we have this great pursuit of the biblical call of humility, and it's got some great elements to it. But right here we begin to see how humility begins to be this focus about how you think about yourself and the importance of having a sense that you think of yourself as being humble, versus the New Testament idea that it's not really about how you think about yourself, but it's about how you disregard your own status and privilege and willingly step down so that you utilize your influence and power in order to pick others up. Let me end with this. I'm going to read for you from translation, one of the better translations, Benedict's opening words on humility. And maybe, just maybe, when hearing this, you'll go, you know what? I could read a book that was written 1,500 years ago and has been one of the most significant books to influence the Christian spiritual tradition myself. And while it may take a little bit of work in translation, it's still pretty good. Now, realize there's history here. There's differences in culture. The monastic movement was just men. Monasteries where you had nuns began to emerge at the same time, but he's speaking to men. So let's pull back our history and go, okay, when he says brothers, he's speaking just to brothers, but the principles and ideas would apply to all of us. Brothers, the Holy Scriptures cries out to us saying, whoever is self-promoting will be humbled, and whoever is humble will be promoted. When it says this, it shows us that all self-promotion is a kind of pride. The prophet shows that he avoids this when he says, Lord, my heart is not lifted up, nor are my eyes fixed on the heights. I've not mixed myself in great affairs, nor in things too wonderful for me. But what if my thoughts are not humble? What if I rise up in pride? then you will refuse me like a mother does a weaned child. And so very pastorally, he's sitting here and he's saying, we know that God lifts up the humble, but the prideful he pushes down. And we know because, and if you're a monk, you realize that you prayed the Psalter, in many instances, all 150 of them every day. And so you'll hear the echoes of the Psalms. And if you don't, that it's okay, but maybe something for you to do some point is begin to pray the Psalms. It's a wonderful school of prayer. But he says, but we know this, and we can hear David in his prayer talk about the fact that he doesn't consider things too highly for himself, but he keeps himself, his perspective humble, low. But then Benedict says, but what happens if that's not really in our hearts? And then he says, okay, if we wish to arrive at the pinnacle of humility, and if we wish to attain speedily to the heavenly heights to which one climbs by humility in this present life, then by our ascending acts we must set up the ladder which appeared to Jacob in a dream. It showed him angels descending and ascending. Doubtless we should understand this descent and ascent as follows. One descends by pride and ascends by humility. The towering ladder is, of course, our earthly life. And when the heart is humble, God raises it up to heaven. We could say that our body and soul are the sides of this ladder into which the divine summons has inserted various rungs of humility and discipline for the ascent. According to Benedict, the way up is down, and the goal is life with God. And when we hear that as Christians, we go, yes. And that's where there is much wisdom here about how to pursue God, and because this is lived out of a life where he committed his entire life, and he became a leader, and people looked and saw in him the way of Jesus. And in this book, you're getting this writing, and you're getting practical expression about how to cultivate and pursue humility. And so, one of my contentions is that the Christian tradition has resources to help us cultivate and pursue. In particular, it's the grace of God and the Holy Spirit. Christ wants to form it in us. But there's wisdom, and there's habits. And some of those things get described here. Now, his understanding of humility wasn't quite as sharp as what we get through Paul, but there's much wisdom here, and we're gonna lean in. I'm gonna share some of that, and then we'll go to Bernard of Clairvaux, and he uses this ladder theme as well, but he does something quite interesting with it. He was one of our more artful and literate monks, a true genius, and we will look at him next week. But that's our hour time together, and hopefully I did not lose you. If I did, let me know. And as far as if this just feels like too pedantic, too kind of deep, and I want to know, because I want this stuff to be something. I'm trying to excite you into reading some of these things, and then there are some real gems here for us to grab a hold of and go, here's something for us to hold on to. And so with that, have a wonderful night, and God bless.